Hello and welcome. My name is Jasmine Hines. My friends call me Jazz, and I do use pronouns she and they. I am the founder of the Inspire Agency, and welcome to this talk on the Great Return, a conversation on the societal return to agriculture. One of the reasons that we are here today, and my panelists will be introducing themselves later, is to reclaim the story, the full story of Dr. George Washington Carver as a socialpreneur, a social activist, humanitarian, a spiritual man that created economic development for Black communities and beyond. So we want to get into this conversation and show the lineage and linkage of his legacy and how that plays out today. So with that, I would like to introduce our guests today, Ms. Shankari Goldstein, Kennae Miller, and Alicia Bell. Welcome. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So I do anticipate that this conversation will be fire because I know each and every one of them personally. But in the spirit of naming your own story and legacy, I will ask that you each introduce yourselves. So Shankari, would you mind going first?
Yeah, thanks, Jazz, for having us. And first and foremost, thanks, Kennae and Alicia, for saying yes and being in community with me today. So my name is Shankari Goldstein, pronouns she, her. I'm a yoga teacher, community activist at the intersection of racism, wellness, agriculture, and the environment, addressing the climate crisis. Currently, I'm a program manager for the Mind and Life Institute and a host for the new Inspiring Minds virtual series that we're doing this year. I've been an event space holder, a creator of yoga festivals. First and foremost, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm a future ancestor, descendant of slaves and European settlers, and I'm a regenerative agriculture farmer. And I'll lift up my recent work too with State of Union Yoga Address with my brother Jay Miles, which has been a great virtual program that we've done the last year.
Thank you so much, sis. I appreciate you. Alicia, would you mind going next?
Sure. Hey, y'all. My name is Alicia Bell. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. And my people that I'm bringing in here, my people are from Alabama and Mississippi. My folks are on my maternal side have been in North Carolina for several generations now. In Charlotte specifically for at least 5. And my people are land stewards and birth workers. A lot of midwifery, a lot of doulaing, a lot of nursing and caretaking in that way, as well as farming, land stewardship, whole stewarding property and in Mississippi and also escaping harm and racism and the way that disconnects us from land stewardship as well. So I'm bringing all of them with me and all of that work with me. The way that shows up in my life today is that I am a part of a gardening collective called Angelou House, where we work with folks to build out gardens that are medicinal and edible in folks' yards. We, right outside of my yard, have several different things growing here. And then I also am the director of a campaign for media reparations at an organization called Free Press. So very much bridging this space between how we reclaim story and how stewarding land honestly teaches me so many things about how to organize and how to campaign and how to move through the world and build the futures that we deserve. So I'm excited to be here with y'all.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alicia. And the next, Kennae Miller.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Jazz, for this opportunity, Shankari and Alicia for being here as well. I am Kennae Miller. I use she, her pronouns. I'm on Cusco Indigenous land, what is now Summerville, South Carolina. It's right outside of Charleston. And I am a change invoker and inner work instigator. And I use yoga a lot of times to do that, but most times it's in having conversation. And really going back to the roots. I happen to sit on the board at this moment and be the board chair for Fresh Future Farm, which is a nonprofit Black woman-led urban farm here in Charleston, South Carolina, that is currently fighting for their land in a food apartheid area, right? I personally returned back to the land because that's what my ancestors asked me to do. I originally grew up in Colorado, so amongst the Cherokee land, and coming back to the South was an invitation for me because my ancestors were here and my roots are here, having all four of my grandparents all being from South Carolina. And so when I come back to the land and I reconnect with the land, this feels like home to me. And so I'm really grateful for this opportunity to just share with others a spiritual connection and really a return back to who we already are as a people.
Fantastic. Well, by the introductions, I'm sure you can already tell the conversation will be fire. But again, we're here to connect George Washington Carver's legacy of being a humanitarian, being dedicated to economic development for farmers, as well as being creative, an artist, and an inventor of over 100 patents. Right? So I wanted to start the conversation with you all introducing yourself to see the connection of how this legacy is carrying out today. And one question that I have for you is, when we talk about something that I heard in all of your introductions was that there seemed to be a calling for you to come back to the land, whether it was through your ancestors, whether it was a spiritual connection, or whether you were just being obedient, right, to your own personal dharma. What did it take for you to say yes to that? That's my question for you. Because often, and I ask that question because oftentimes callings can be hard to say yes to, right, to submit to. And so I just wanted to ask, what did it take for you to say yes?
I'll go first. And y'all catch me if this gets long-winded, but I know that I've always had a very strong spiritual connection, and my mother nurtured that as a child coming up. And I knew I was supposed to do something with my hands, that my hands were gifted, but I didn't exactly know what that was. And so in high school, I took my first trip back down south from Colorado, and I was just like, this is where my people are. This is where culture is. Like, I need to be here. And I got accepted to my first choice college, but I didn't end up going because I didn't want that to be left on my single mother at the time. So I ended up joining the military, and I joined the military reserves, and I also became a police officer. But the department that took me was in the state of Georgia. And so at the time, my husband was stationed here in South Carolina, so we would drive to see each other. And I'll never forget the first time driving from Georgia back on Highway 17 through the swamps, passing through Savannah, and just being able to roll down the window and feel the spirit of the ancestors in the tree as I passed through, like, over the Combahee River, and just knowing something is very different about the spirit of where I'm at. Being able to look out to the trees and witness, this is where we hid, this is where we ran, this is also what held us and contained us as we moved towards freedom when others couldn't see our divinity anymore. And even then, this is about 2008, I still was to some degree in denial. I was like, ooh, this is strong and I don't want to be here. But that year, I did end up moving to Charleston. And I knew I did not want to raise children here. There was just something heavy about the entire atmosphere, the environment here, and I wanted no parts of it. So I went full time for the military, and I struggled. I had a very hard time. I faced a lot of oppression, from racism to sexism, Being in the military, you really do lose all of your rights. And it's at the expense to defend a country that's not going to defend you. And I remember in 2012, all I kept saying is, I just want freedom. I just want freedom. And so when I left the military, my husband was still in the military. We ended up getting stationed in Hawaii, and talk about a breath of fresh air. I got there and I remembered learning and being embraced by a culture of people that were not ashamed of who they were. And they also nurtured the land. Hawaiians really believe, I don't want to say it because I'm going to say it wrong, but they really believe in living in harmony with nature and only taking what you need, and you put back the rest. And I found that to be so beautiful, because I didn't coming from mainland USA. Folks buy things and participate in consumer. We don't even need it. We buy in bulk items just to have storehouses of bulk items that really aren't good for us, and we don't need them. So I started gardening and farming there. And then when I came back to the States, I was like, okay, I got to keep this going. And the first place I went was Fresh Future Farm. And Jermaine Jenkins really embraced me. And she was like, okay, we don't usually have a lot of young people that are here, but sure. And all I wanted to do was pick the weeds. And what it became for me was not only a home, but also a meditative process of, as I'm pulling the weeds, what is the soil teaching me? What am I learning about how I show up in the world? Even now, learning to forage and being like, man, we've been told all this time dandelions are weeds, right? And we discard them. And to know that nature's medicine is right here and has been here for us this whole time. Now I'm seeing how all of these things come together. And although I didn't know it at that moment, when I first drove through the swamps, the ancestors are like, this is exactly where you need to be. And so answering that call is not easy. I'm not going to say that it is easy. It doesn't come up in a way that you would suspect, right? You're not going to just go to school and someone's like, this is your thing, right? You might get led a whole and completely different direction, and that's what you need to follow. So that was my experience.
Beautiful, Kennae. Thank you for sharing that story. I learned some more about you today that I didn't know. So thank you for sharing that. Alicia or Shankari?
Yeah, Sister Kennae, I mean, I resonated so much with your story, and that's why I get down with you, because I think we have similar journeys, and I think that there is just now becoming more representation of people like you and myself that are looking at this industry of farming and agriculture from the full spectrum of the deep implications of like trauma and mental health and reconciliation, and why wellness workers, yoga, practitioners are so critical to the aspects of like joining this community of farming and agriculture workers. So I'm so glad that you touched on that, because that's so much a part of what brought me to this very much like land-based living experience. And so for me, like my story is one of, a child that grew up in the suburbs, and yet I was always that hippy dippy kid that would be outside making potions, collecting those dandelion weeds, making herbal medicine. Don't nobody know what it's going to actually do, but I would bring it in the house like it was some magical potion. And, my parents are very moderate, like kind of conservative, but have moved more moderate over the years. And I was just the total opposite of that. I was like barefoot running, just like totally enveloped in the land, playing down by the creek for hours all day long. And then, my people are also, I appreciate your story so much, Alicia, because my people come from that, tradition of farming, from my European roots to my African enslaved roots. I can trace back a little bit to our ancestors being in Louisiana and Georgia and primarily North Carolina, and just hearing stories about like my great grandmothers, Ruby and Nellie, like they're growing all their food on their land, and all my, grandmother and my father going back and connecting with that Southern culture that I think so many of us resonate with as enslaved descendants, but just have really just been pulled from those root systems through the Great Migration of the mid-century. And so I think that for me, when I look at the connection with my parents, because so much of our journey stemmed from like our relationship with our parents, I have this very strained relationship with my father, who is Black and became a product of the system. He like was in jail, many cousins that are in jail and life for murder. And they were like very much enveloped in that like urban, like product of, we know we have no connection to the land. And yet when I would go on those weekend visits with my dad, he would always take me outside. And I really appreciated that about our relationship. And so I say all that to say that as I've gotten older and I've worked through those traumas of like feeling disconnected from my father and, feeling inadequate in my body and anxiety and all those things, those mental illnesses and trauma, the only thing that ever made me feel really good was the land. The healing of that process of forgiving my father was like, well, damn, what was good? What was good about that relationship? Well, he'd always take me, to the monuments and on the art walks and, to these national parks and to these zoos. And it was like always something outside, because I think he was just like this dad trying to like figure it all out. What am I going to do with this kid on the weekends? And so, but I just came back to just really appreciate that, those aspects. And I say all that to say that, I didn't know that I was just going to become this homesteader. This started 4 years ago, and it started as a place where my partner and I could just be self-sufficient. And then I realized it was morphing into a whole concept and lifestyle, and that it was just like, it was more than growing my own food and owning land. I was becoming more. My day-to-day life was becoming regenerative. It was becoming holistic. It was informing my yoga practice. My yoga practice has shifted dramatically in the last 10 years. And so I really think that we are often called to this community of land stewardship, much like we're called to the practice of yoga through trauma, through healing, through looking for coping mechanisms to, find another day to get up and take that next breath. So that's my journey of that connection.
Beautiful, Shankari. Thank you for that. That's what's up. Alicia.
Yeah. As you were talking about growing up and being barefoot and running around a creek, I was laughing inside because I was the opposite of that growing up. And I remember a teacher that I had at one point telling me that I needed to go climb more trees and make more mud pies. And I was definitely like that kid that was way more comfortable in intellectual conversations than like emotional conversations. And it's funny though, because the school that I went to, or one of the schools that I went to in elementary school was right next to like a whole patch of just like kudzu and honeysuckle, because that's what overgrows here in North Carolina. And so even though I was like not spending time outside in ways that were just very like abundant and expansive, there were still these ways that that land was showing up consistently, right? So picking honeysuckles and like sipping the nectar from them is a thing that we used to do during recess all the time. The house that I lived in, we had a creek in the backyard. And so we would get off the bus early, stop early, because we would walk the creek and then go up the backyard instead of like getting off right in front of the house. And I was raised by my grandparents, but my mama was always outside, like working on flowers. That was her thing. She just, and now actually I'm lucky to have a lily growing in our yard that is, that 4 generations old, that's split over 4 generations, because that's work that my mama did to like steward flowers that she was given from her mom. And my papa was always growing, always had gardens, and always was growing like tomatoes and cucumbers and squash. And those were not things I was ever helping them with. It was not like, those are not I know that they happened. I was there. We ate the food. I saw the flowers. but it was not a space where I was. And so it wasn't until I was living in Oakland, in California, that I started to build relationships with land in a different way, right? I think there's always these kind of constants, like land is always showing up for us. The ocean is always showing up for us. Water is always showing up for us. But it wasn't until I was living in Oakland that I was more intentional about that relationship. And it was through the practice of herbalism that I started doing that and started learning, thanks to these excellent herbalists out in Oakland, folks, Lisan and Ilokin and Megan, folks who helped create space for queer and trans folks of color to learn herbalism and to learn medicine, and had space for that, and talked about foraging and talked about both the ways that plants are medicinal, but also help create boundaries and the ways that plants and medicine can be used to harm enemies if we need that. So it was very much a duality of how we experience and understand medicine. What is medicine for? And when I was kind of at this crossroads of trying to figure out coming back to North Carolina, my mother had passed away in the summer of 2016. And soon after that, the city was on fire because of the death of Keith Lamont Scott. And there were so many burning things that were calling me back to North Carolina. Charlotte is the place I was born and raised, but I was living on the whole other side of the country at the time. And so it was my mother's death. It was the city literally being on fire. And being here during that time period, because of things that were going on with my family, and this really excellent inventor, engineer named Vic, who used to live in Charlotte. We were at a dinner one night, and I was talking about the decision to come back to North Carolina. And I remember this moment so clearly because it was like a moment from a movie. Like, we walked outside, it's raining, we had just been inside, we're like saying goodbye. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do. And Vic looked at me and said, "What do you want the story of your life to be?" And it was so clear in that moment that I wanted the story of my life to be here in North Carolina. And so I just started setting that in motion in different ways. And because of community, like, also was able to have the resources to make that happen, and the structure to make that happen. And coming back to North Carolina is when I started digging more, literally and figuratively, into this land stewardship practice. And it was a lot of exploration. It's been a lot of exploration, a lot of experimentation, a lot of just learning and being receptive. I remember one of my like favorite things I've ever grown is loofah gourd. And that it was so accidental. It was, there's a high school that does a plant sale here, and they were out of all the things I wanted, but they had loofah gourd left. And I was like, well, came to support the high school, so I guess I'll get this loofah gourd. Planted it. We were out there with my nibblings and some friends and chosen family, just like out there cleaning up the yard and the beds where we were going to be growing. And I remember the time Harrison, it was 2, and just like pulled the loofah gourd whole out of the ground. And I was like, "Oh no, it's not a weed." So I was like, well, we put it back in really fast. And about a month or so later, it started growing again. And we didn't know it was that. At first we thought it was just like some rogue zucchini that was growing, but it was like vining in really different ways because it was going up the trees and it was like coming down and it was hanging. And we were able to harvest sponges that year, and have sponges for at least 6 months that we didn't need to buy. We were like using them for the house, using them for the shower, all kinds of things. And I think that experience and the experimentation, but also just the learning that happened in that garden space, and the things I continue to learn, is what's kept me kind of in pursuit of this deepening of relationship.
There is so much learning from the land that I'm hearing from your stories. And I'm also hearing the need to be well resourced as you're developing your relationship with land, but also being a steward of land. Shankari, can you talk a little bit more about like the importance of that resource for people who would be interested in cultivating this relationship with the land?
Yeah. I think I just did an interview recently with Amber Tan, and it was about couples and relationships. And I recognize that my situation is definitely one of privilege where, I'm one of the few farmers of color that can own her own land, as well as have access to managing 80-acre properties and like in the final stages of, drafting contracts to lease another 40 acres. That's not the normal experience for most farmers of color. And I think what has worked for me is in partnership with my husband, Dan, is that we were really clear from the start, like what our intentionality was with the land. And so because that, again, back to my conversation with Amber, was people kind of come into this industry on the kind of like I guess you want to say like the market garden to higher level farming side with this like romanticized, idealized version of like what farming looks like. And the reality is that like, and I'm like, it's hard. And I wanted to cuss there, but I'm going to stay calm, but it's hard. It's hard. Often days you feel broken. Often days you feel like a failure. What came to mind, Alicia, when you were telling that story about your loofah was like, most of the time you're figuring it out by mistakes and you become this accidental gardener. You become this accidental farmer without even realizing it. And so community, collective community around this work is really imperative, especially in the early stages of coming into like relationship with the land. I've vibed off Kennae, and we've talked about like, her journey and exploration with chickens, and, like finding your community to like be resourceful, I think is really critical, because again, like back to that statistic around mental health, anxiety, the farming agriculture industry, on average, it's like a double suicide rate compared to other industries in this economy. And so that to me was like a light bulb went off for me of like what is the weaving and the intersection of these contemplative practices with farming and land ownership, because isn't the land supposed to heal you? But the reality is that it's USDA loans that you can't afford to pay back. You're living in a welfare system. You're owned by capitalists, Monsanto and Purdue, and you're struggling to get your head above water. On top of that, you're fighting a looming climate crisis that is like, destroying your crops. And so it's about reframing and retraining the land stewards to understand that there's a collective community calling. It takes a support. It takes a village. We do need to return to these indigenous ways of being with the land, which is why, my practice is one of regenerative agriculture, which you can say is indigenous traditions, and not that of like a sustainable model, because I don't want to sustain what is already broken. I want to repair and give back and renourish and rebuild and put systems in place that are then going to create, models for our future generations. So like that loofah sponge, you've got to be a sponge in the beginning and like not go into it with like expectations of being rich and being the next Leah Penniman. Like, come on now. The reality is that you're covered in manure most of the time. You're tired, you're broke, and you're like when I got on this call, Jasmine, it was like, girl, I can't even. Like, I just had a whole moment with my herd dog, animals running wild. But like now I'm here. I'm in this practice with y'all. We're in this community conversation. We're in Sangha. And so that healing, I'm in that space of like just below the surface of that meditation practice of like, all right, I'm in that sweet spot. And so it sustains me to get up and keep doing this. So supporting and having partners, whether it's a business partner, whether it's a community garden effort, whether it's Kennae with, Fresh Future Farm, like that collective is really important, and understanding that there's going to be those people out there that want to do their own individual thing, but the community is really, it takes the community to heal, not just your individual land, but that intersects and heals the whole planet. So.
Yeah. I love to talk about the regenerative process there, not only in the act of gardening and farming, but also the regenerative process that's happening now that helps rebuild your own coffers and know that the work that you're doing is beyond your own farm, like beyond your own land, and extends into North Carolina and into South Carolina and beyond. It's so much more bigger than you. So thank you for eliciting that. Alicia, you were jumping in?
Yeah, I just really wanted to echo that piece around it being hard. Because over here, so I live next door to my mama, and collectively we only have an acre of land. So when you're, and it's been a wild experience, transforming lawn into like food and medicine is a whole thing in and of itself. We've gotten notes in the mailbox from neighbors. We don't live in a neighborhood with an HOA or whatever, but we have gotten notes in the mailbox that are like, what are you doing to the beautiful lawn? The grass was so green before. And I'm like, there's still some of it like right over there, y'all. Like it's, but also like you can get these rosemary pieces if you want. And it's been such an interesting experience because even like putting in fruit trees, like living in Oakland, it was really lovely because I was able to live in a space where you just like picked fruit off trees and picked herbs off bushes as you like walked to the train. And that was so much a part of the culture of like where I was living. And folks would just have like an abundance of lemons or pomelos or whatever, and just like have them out for people. And so when we were thinking about what we were going to do outside, and we're putting out fruit trees, there was folks who were coming by, family friends who were like, "Are you sure you want those so close, like to the edge? Like, what if people take your fruit?" And I was like, "What if people take our fruit?" Like it's been illuminating in so many ways, but also we talk all the time, my family and I, we talk all the time about the different requirements it would be to have the 40 acres, right? To have 5 acres, 10 acres. I work full time, right? And I also am trying to steward and manage this acre of land outside, like, and parent, like I'm raising 3 children. So I'm also, and like somehow have some sort of social relationships, unclear about all of those pieces. But it's a lot. And that's just in the acre, right? Like when I think about we've been able, because we've been working in collective with folks, we've been able to kind of collectively build up the tools that we need. But those weren't the things that we had at first, right? Like we didn't have the hose, the tillers, like all of those pieces that we needed initially. We didn't have the know-how even of like, how are we going to like transform so much of this? And so it's been a collective learning process, but also a collective resourcing. And the thing that's really lovely about that is that I can be outside and I know who, like, I remember who contributed to what. Like I look at this fig bush and I remember like this person named Henry being on the hill, like digging the hole for the fig bush. Right. And I like look at the mulch that's around some of the trees and things like that. And I know who put that down. And And that's been really incredible, but also so necessary, because it's not something that like one person, even two people could take on. It requires so much more than that. And I think so much about the ways that other systems, whether it be economic systems, housing, gentrification, the things that push us away from each other, either in time or in space, how much that keeps us from community. Because the social relationships, the friendships, the chosen family that I am able to like uphold and am the closest to, and like those are some of the folks that I'm like calling to pick up the kids sometimes and things like that. Like those are folks who I grow with. Those are folks who I do land stewardship with, and it's because that's what we're able to do together, and we are able to find each other. But I want more of that. I'm like always wanting more of that. More of like folks close by who aren't leaving notes in the mailbox saying what happened to the grass, but are coming by to pick up some of the peppers on the table on the edge, right? Like trying to kind of constantly balance in that space. And it makes me think a lot about aesthetic, because it's also like growing food and medicine is not always pretty. It's not you don't get the photo op of the thing where it's like all the things are in a row and it's all like there's no weeds and everything is perfectly lined up. And I know that aesthetic brings people in. And so that I'm always balancing between like, how do we bring more folks in? And like, also, how do we just honor that like this is real and this is what's happening? And so I think, and so much of that is, I mean, Jasmine, to what you were saying earlier about story. It's about how we tell the story of this, what stories we're lifting up, to get a sense of like what's possible and what's real.
Thank you, Alicia, for that. I wanted to also add, just add on to what Alicia shared and Shankari shared. Jermaine is like a huge mentor for me. And I remember attending the first South Carolina Black Farmers Conference, where she gathered farmers from across the state to come together. And we were in such a Black space that so many farmers had never even felt before, to be able to connect with the man that had the quail eggs and the person that had sugarcane all together in an experience. And one of the things I remember Jermaine saying that day was that, you know, we have to remember that resources to us are not just financial resources. Resources to us are, you know, my chicken coop was raided, right? I lost half of my flock, and who has the knowledge on how I need to protect from these predators? Who has the knowledge on where I could get other animals from to help me? Who knows that cousin John down the road has a donkey to give up, right? And so being able to realize that our resources don't just look like they don't look financial like people would like to believe our resources are. Our resources come from each other, as far as how to grow the soil, how to be the soil, how we're connected to each other. You know, I think a lot of people come into land stewardship from a colonized white savior perspective. Like, we're going to save the world. We are single-handedly going to stop climate change. And I don't think that happens for people of color. A lot of us come into, or we don't come into, we return to those practices because there's a need there, right? Like, whether it's living in a food apartheid area, whether there's food insecurity, right? The easiest thing for me to do, even though I was living in Hawaii, was to grow my own food, because buying an $8 gallon of milk that has been exported and expires 2 days after I purchased it, when they said I had another week, that causes a financial strain on me. So how can I grow something that will still fulfill the needs of my family and also not harm the environment? I need to learn to do that myself. But where am I getting seeds from? Oh, my girlfriend down here has some stuff growing in her yard, and she got some seeds to give to me, so I'm going to get started. Or even coming back here and, you know, I was hesitant about even having the chicken experience at first, but having the opportunity to learn about our ancestral and cultural practices with raising chickens, and then being comfortable to do that and know that even though other folks are like, wow, what kind of person are you? Because I mean, you live in a suburban looking home, but you got these chickens in this backyard running around. Your kids are chasing chickens. We're hearing cock-a-doodle-doos and and stuff at all kinds of times, right? But being able to say that when I know that my sister is sick, when I know that my sister is about to have surgery, I can go right back to the land and I can harvest yarrow for her. I can grab some eggs together. I can get some cucumbers and some tomatoes, and it didn't cost me nothing because I have it in abundance as a resource. I'm able to take care of a need that we have where she doesn't have to go get in somebody's welfare line. She doesn't have to look to someone else to get to make her fill out some application and validate why she's in need of having fresh food and fresh vegetables. So really that connection, not only to the land, but connection to each other as a resource, and that sense of community is so powerful.
When you were talking about that, it made me think about the work of Fannie Lou Hamer and the Freedom Farm Pig Bank. And her work is something I think about a lot. But Fannie Lou Hamer, someone who folks know a lot for her work around like civic engagement and voting, similar to George Washington Carver, folks knowing him as the Peanut Man. Fannie Lou Hamer gets like dabbed as the voting woman. She did the things, but she also organized a pig bank. And so she worked with families who she was organizing with to raise pigs. And taught them about how to raise them, how to, when they birthed, they would give a pig back to the bank so that it would be regenerative. And then also taught them about how to slaughter pigs and how to harvest them and honor their lives and all of that. And so they were able to create a situation where folks didn't have to buy pork from grocery stores for about a year or so because of the pig bank. And she did it because she knew that if folks didn't have food, then there was no reason to organize around voting. Because if folks didn't have food, then it was harder to be civically engaged. And so when you're talking about being able to provide these fruits and vegetables and medicines, the yarrow, the herbs, and its connection to like not having to be on the welfare line or not having to engage in the grocery store economy, then it does remind me so much of the work of Fannie Lou Hamer, and how much we can lift that up and connect with that and kind of recreate some of those things today.
What I love about the Have a Conversation is developing into a realization of our own empowerment, our own community empowerment, and lifting up ourselves, right? So that we have the power to shift culture and not be dependent on a system that is committed to harming, right? That we have the power within our own ancestral line, from our own knowledge, from way back from Africa, because the enslaved Africans that were stolen came as engineers, as farmers, as doctors, as herbalists. And that we get to benefit from returning to our own ancestral spaces. Thank you for naming those things. Shankari, you had something?
No, I was just going to say, like, so much from the resource perspective, and this is why all of these things just intersect from the yoga community to our whole social justice fight. Food, water, that's freedom, that's liberation. And the work that Fannie Lou did, like, that was an access way to our liberation, and it was immediately dominated, right? And so what we're talking about, like, with that community building, and I think you touched on Alicia and you did Kennae, is like that cultivating sacred trust. And we've been able to do that so well amongst our own community. And so that's really what I think so many of the farmers of color in this industry are trying to, like, be more amplified, like be more of like a representation, because we have the tools to create these systems within our own community. And something else you touched on too, Alicia, like the whole, like, it has to be pretty. And like, I get it, people are asking to come on, garden tours, and, Lord help you if you do food, not lawns. And I cannot tell you how much I have tried to extrapolate every part of green grass that I can here, or create infrastructures where my animals can then graze that grass to manage it. Because I don't want to waste my time just out there mowing grass all day. And so for me, that leads back to the regenerative and our ancestral indigenous ways of growing food. It's not about a monoculture. It is about polyculture gardening, crops, edible landscapes, increasing biodiversity. That is not how food grows in the real world. And because we have been brainwashed to go into this monoculture, big agriculture, large crops, that's where the greater implications for climate disaster come in, because people are now degrading the land, the Midwest, like the degradation of the soil. Soil is life. Soil is my thing. Some people have seeds. Some people have, their connection with livestock. I care about soil. I think everything eventually is going to intersect and connect to our relationship with soil. And our climate crisis issues come so much from like flash flooding and fires, forest fires, because we just till and destroy to get these large single monocrops going. And to me, when I think about it, when I step back, this is when the light bulb went off for me, that like all of this social justice stuff is all connected to farming and wellness and appropriation and all these, it's all intersecting. Is like monoculture to me is like a form of white supremacy. It is a form of white culture, dominant culture coming in and saying, I don't want to have diversity. I want to have the greatest, most single crop that all looks the same, that's all pretty in a row, that I can dominate and destroy this ecosystem. And when you step back and you say, like, no, like, what were my people doing back in the day? What is the indigenous First Peoples traditions? What is our African heritage? We weren't growing food like that. We were doing 3 sister crops. We were interspersing medicine with our kale, and that's not how food and plants naturally grow out in the world. Purple dead nettles is intermixing with my tulips right now. I'm not going to go out and pull out my tulips and put them in a row. Like, so that's where I think that mentality of connecting with those like-minded people that are seeing the full spectrum of this holistic circle, and getting out of this, like, this is the way it's supposed to be done. Because we could say that about yoga. This is the way it's supposed to be done. We could say about how we're supposed to do our hair. This is straighten your hair. This is the way it's always been done. It's all like, how are we taking back our story?
I wanted to add to that as well. So Alicia shared about like the pig banks with Fannie Lou Hamer, and Shankari is sharing about like monoculture and how dominant culture wants that one single crop. And a return back to the land, as much as it is liberation, it is still a battle, because when dominant culture sees that you're providing for yourself, wait a minute, why have sales gone down in this area, right? Because everybody has a garden. They want to tax that soil. They want to tax the pots for the plants more. They want to come up with more HOA rules that if your yard doesn't look like this, or if you haven't hedged a lawn, or if you're growing in your front yard, that's a problem. You have to grow behind a fence. Well, who's got time to build a fence when I'm making my own food because I don't have money or time to be able to go to a grocery store, right? And so dominant culture is always going to find its way in and makes it that much harder. Here in South Carolina, I happen to live in the county, but I live in an area where we have an HOA. My limit is 8 chickens, and I know that, right? So the front of my house looks like a suburb, but there's possums and foxes and snapping turtles and all kind of stuff going on in my backyard. But I'm not even able to, let's say, fire at a predator to protect my crops because somebody else's rules, right? If my HOA says, oh, wow, your banana trees have grown too tall, right? Or you have vines growing on your fence. We don't like the look of that, right? They want to fine me. Well, if I can't afford to pay the fines, next thing I know, at least in the state of South Carolina, they can put a lien on your property. If you don't pay those fines, then they can take your property from you and rent it out. So now it's still that same loss of land, just in another way, because why? Dominant culture doesn't want to see you liberated and doing for self, right? And so this is even a way of noticing that even though I'm here in South Carolina, and that might be the seed that's planted here through the webbing and our interconnection, I'm sure North Carolina got their own stuff going on where they're trying to prevent people from going, and Virginia's got something else, and Georgia's got something else. So then we see, again, like Shankari said, that webbing of how we're all interconnected just in different places, it all connects. So how can we show up together as a resource and say, you know what, maybe there needs to be, a federal suit that, prevents us from having to lose homes if you're in the HOA area. And if that's all you've got to grow, maybe there needs to be a cap on who can produce or provide, whether that's potting soil, whether that's seeds, or however that goes, right? And so really just networking and resourcing with each other, even for the heads up that, hey, dominant culture ain't happy, y'all, we doing something, right? We eating them greens and they busting and they been the superfood to us, but everybody else is just now getting on the bandwagon, right? Or here in South Carolina, they really love the way landscaping looks for yards and for specific neighborhoods to look right. And I'm not gonna lie, I've drove by plenty of times, but that kale has gone to seed. Like, all they're gonna do is pull it up and they're gonna toss it and put a new plant. Where I'm like, I wonder if they would notice if I gathered some kale, right? But really being able to look at land and nature in such a different way and know that even though in South Carolina, that may be a portion of the battle here as I plant those seeds and try to get things growing, dominant culture is never going to be happy and is not going to make it easy. Just like when they had the Homestead Act, they wanted Black folks to be able to prove that they could produce something, to prove that they were actually citizens, to prove all of these things just to be able to have and steward land, right? And so really being able to resource and support each other when you get that next notice. Or for me, like I said, I lost half a flock of my chickens, and I was like, I didn't expect this, but it took another homesteader to tell me, oh no, you had two predators. The fox ate the whole thing, but the possum came and just drank the blood and left the body. And that's how the fox got, right? I would have known those things on my own because I was hopeful and expecting, okay, we're good. They were in the coop. They were asleep. Nothing's going to happen. We got good eggs. Wrong. Dominant culture will always find a way to show up. And nature does show up too and does what it does. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Word. And I think to those points of like how we have to resist and like the multiple ways that we have to resist, I think that's the other way that this like battle of monoculture, polyculture comes up, because there's so many things, like when you're lifting up that like maybe we need to like have a federal suit around this, like maybe we need to make this a regulation. I think that in the social justice activism organizing space, so much comes up around like the way to do a thing or like the best way to do a thing. And folks will say like, oh, like this thing is not going to work. This like protest is not going to work. So we need to pursue like economic success or land owning, or we need to do community building. And the way that we win is all of it. Like when there's a lot of conversation coming up right now, for example, around like money being raised by Black women organizers and homes being purchased and things like that. And as much as I'm holding this like critique, right, and loving critique of movement, I'm also holding that in order for folks to march on Selma, like there were folks who had to own land. And there were places that people needed to put tents, and that's what they did. So more so than saying like it's any one of these things, that it's that it is protest or it is having land stewardship, and that looks like ownership in capitalism currently, right? More than saying it's any one of those things, it has to come back to who we're in community with, because it wouldn't matter if you were raising chickens and kale and yarrow if you didn't have a community to go to and be like, what is happening? And the same thing is true when we organize and when we fight and when we win. None of it matters if it's not done in community. If we're not purchasing property and that's happening in community, then it doesn't matter. If we're not protesting and petitioning in community, it doesn't matter. If we're not doing storytelling and journalism and all of that outside in community, it doesn't matter. But if we do have the community, if we're in relationship and we're in right relationship with folks, and we're engaging these varieties of tactics, then it's all how we win. Because we have to overwhelm white supremacy. And we have to create a movement that is so beautiful and juicy and inviting and enveloping that it turns people who are against us, and it keeps them away, and it brings more people in. And all of these things that y'all are talking about, all those different things bring different folks in. And so that's one of the things I'm constantly thinking about is like when I remember growing butternut squash, and I was like, oh, this grows really well next to this okra because it's like low and this is high and like all of these things. And it made me think about how I show up in space, like who is like doing this low groundwork. Like when we think about the Three Sisters farming, right? Like who's doing the mulching? Who's doing the like stand up tall, the charisma of the corn? Like who's wrapping around and doing that caretaking? Like all of that is how we have to show up and win.
Speaking of who's doing that part, can you talk a little bit about how media reparations plays into this work of liberation, in particular when we talk about being land stewards and building right relationship and community? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. For me, one of the things I'm always thinking, and like ever since I realized that there was, and I remember reaching out to you, Jasmine, and you were like, what are you texting me about? But I remember reaching out to Jasmine one time and being like, so who makes screws and who makes nails? How can I learn how to make screws? Because from the moment that I realized, and like, you know, we have always known that screws existed, but at some point it occurred to me that someone's making that. And whoever is making that is going to continue to benefit based off of whatever we create. And so if we need to get rid of the screw maker, we have to learn how to make screws. And so it's always pulling me into like, what is the core of this? And so for me, some of what I've figured out and doing that deepening work is that story, that journalism, that storytelling, media making is so much the core of all of the systems that we exist in. And similar to what you were saying, Shankari, earlier about the soil, like I think a lot about story as the soil of our society, because it's the story that creates the culture and the public perception, and therefore the policy and the structures and the infrastructure. It's the story that creates the imagination that we're able to create in. The story is what's allowed for white supremacist imagination to flourish. And the grip on news and information and textbooks and television and radio and music and all of that. And so the work that I'm stewarding now is around media reparations as a way to reclaim and reimagine and put into practice the way that we are able to tell stories as Black folks, and the way that Black stories are able to be visible and get to other Black people without having to go through white hands. Right now, if a Black person wanted to tell a story to another Black person outside of someone they were in direct relationship with, it would have to go through white hands at some point, either as an editor, a distributor, a printer, all of a social media platform, any of those things. And so I'm stewarding work around media reparations to co-create a future with folks where that's not the case. And the way that relates, there's, like I said, there's so much I learned from the land work that informs the way that we organize. But it's also because when I think about how we're able to get to a place where folks who want to steward land are able to, a lot of that is about story too. Like, what are the stories that need to get told to create the policies that get passed? What is the culture that needs to get created so that we have different infrastructure? And so it's very reciprocal for me, and which is and why I know that it takes bringing in all different kinds of folks to inform the work and to be a part of the work, because story, media, journalism, television, film, it impacts all of us. So that's the work we're doing. It's through a project called Media 2070, and I'm really excited about it because I'm excited to win. So I think about this like my polyculture a lot, because I think a lot about winning. And as much as I know there's like several wins we won't have in this lifetime, and it's going to take several generations for like big wins, I also know there's wins that we can have in this lifetime. And every time I'm able to harvest a crop, I know that I can win in this lifetime. Every time I'm able to like build a new garden bed, I know I can win in this lifetime. So excited for that.
I feel like this conversation is winning. I truly do. Kennae, can you talk a little bit about future farms and what they need right now? What is the need for future farms, and how can we be of support in the effort?
Yes, thank you. So Fresh Future Farm is an urban farm. Again, it was born out of Jermaine Jenkins' personal need to have good fruits and vegetables for her family. She had children that had food allergies, and working at a food bank only gives someone certain things, right? I don't know if you've ever received food from a food bank, but it's typically beans, rice. Nobody gives a can opener. There's no stove for that. There's no like culturally relative food. And so Jermaine was working with the food bank and was like, wow, what if people were able to grow their own food? And all of my neighbors had access to good food. So she went to the city, and she got a piece of land that they weren't using, donated to her for a lease. It's less than an acre. And from that, she birthed Fresh Future Farm. So they have fruit trees. All of the food that is growing there goes directly to the neighbors and the neighborhood. And then recently they just completed a Kickstarter to not only purchase the land, but also they have a grocery store on the land. So people can come in and purchase what they need. And they're working with a local chef that is producing culturally relative meals. So imagine, children coming out of school and not having anything other than a McDonald's or a red drink or Cheeto Puffs to eat, right? They're able to go into Fresh Future Farm, and for $1, they get shrimp and grits after school that they can purchase. And it's culturally relative. And majority of the food is also cooked so that it's anti-inflammatory, right? To work with our elders in the community as well. But they're culturally relative meals at a price that people can afford. And all of the produce and everything is pulled right there from the farm. So we know exactly who donated it, who contributed it. And where we're at is recently, gentrification is happening everywhere. And so there's another organization that's trying to buy all of the land surrounding the farm. And so Jermaine really wanted to just own her parcel of land. And the city has been very resistant. So they raised all the funding about 2 years ago now. They raised the funding in 45 days to purchase the land, and still have not been able to purchase the land. From, again, dominant culture choosing to show up and work through other organizations that don't have experience, that don't have, a history of being able to do this work or produce anything that actually benefits the community. But because of whiteness, they're allowed to do so. And so right now, in addition to holding on to the space that they have, they're looking at moving to other locations. Like there's Jenkins Institute here that is, it was about 89 acres, if not more, of land that was given to a Black man, Mr. Jenkins, and he actually had an orphanage on it. They used to have a band. And so she's looking at taking some of the work over there so that it stays within community, right? Because the resources that she needs the land without dominant culture trying to prevent that. So right now, really, the similar to what Alicia is sharing, the biggest battle is getting the story out there, sharing the narrative. So there has been a documentary called Rooted, and it basically tells a lot of the journey of what Jermaine has had to go through just to make this happen. From wanting to fight for food justice to being denied opportunities to even meet with city council, where they will not meet with her at all anymore, to trying to buy land, but because of the way she shows up, they don't want to talk with or organize with a Black woman, that she has to send someone else in that they would accept. To even Jermaine's own personal struggles with her health, while she's trying to do this work and care for her community. And so you can see where I come into the film as well, as far as sharing yoga as a healing practice, connection to the breath, and being able to provide that in a way for farmers and those that are interested in farming. And, it's one thing to be front lines. It's one thing to be grassroots and move in movement for liberation work. And we also know that when we don't take care of ourselves, whether that's eating, whether that's managing the stress, we've seen so many of our organizers and grassroots leaders dying from high blood pressure, dying from the exact same things, from not having the access to care for ourselves. And so that's where really the holistic approach or wellness of yoga can come in, and again, work hand in hand with how we support each other. And so a lot of that is featured in the documentary. And again, really, that's just to get more awareness out about what Jermaine has been faced with and what she's been battling. But her goal is to not only win her land, but to now teach other young farmers, right? She's working on pairing older farmers that are maybe tired and no longer want to farm with younger farmers that now have the energy, that are really interested, pairing them together so that the community has what it needs and we don't lose any more land. And so if you want to check them out, you can visit freshfuturefarm.org. There's donations. You can check out the trailer to the film itself. And that's in the biggest ways that you could show some support right now. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Kennae. And we'll be sure to broadcast that information as well, hoping to have Jermaine on the interview her later on. And before we gather ourselves to come to an end, I hate to have to end this. It's so good. I wanted to say thank you to Alicia, because I know you have to run, and so appreciative of conversation contributions that you've made to this space, and all the people, all the folk that you brought with you. Thank you so very much. Bye. So Shankari, I want to know from your area and there in Virginia, your farm work that you're involved in, what are ways that we can support you at this point?
Yeah, I love that. Just really quick, just to touch back, I love that Alicia brought up the whole conversation around supporting particularly women of color that are asking for funds and asking for access to raise money for capital for land. And I'm going to be real honest with you. And I think Sonia Renee Taylor did a similar post about this in the last 48 hours. We need to stop putting roadblocks in place for women of color and people of color to get theirs. And I think that there is something it's just so frustrating when I see us tearing each other down and questioning decisions of how we use capital to bring joy into our life and to bring privilege into our lives. So I just want to name that. And I'm going to say that I advocate for providing, donating. I donated to so many people's campaigns last year for land ownership, because you could see the shift. You could see the emotional and cultural shift of people's perception with, like, now we are trapped in this global pandemic, and we, running out of food in grocery stores, not having fresh air to breathe, not having land to step outside and be outside of their four walls. And so I'm totally down with us as a collective community finding ways to donate $20 here, $10 here, $50 here, because if we do that, think about the impact of that. The amount of, you can't stop that kind of love. You can't stop that kind of community. You can't dominate that when we are all so aligned in our purpose. And I'll just say like one more thing that came to mind when she was saying that. It brought me back to a conversation that I had in a training with you, Jasmine, when you said, nothing about us is for us. Without us, all means all, and all is all things, right? And so there's that collective community of like, when we all win, when one of us wins, we all win, right? And by all things, I mean all of us as human species, and all things, the trees, the worms, the soil, the water, it is all interconnected, and understanding that we belong to all of this, not just this human to human interaction. So I just want to say that before we close, because I think that's such an incredibly important piece for this community to use and take forward in their journey. As far as like what's going on for me, yeah, so you already shared, like I'm most recently been hosting the Inspiring Mind series through the Mind and Life Institute. You can log on to view those episodes at mindandlife.org. We just wrapped up our 6th and final episode of season 1 with Amishi Jha, who's a researcher and does a lot of researching on the brain and mind wandering, and how, bringing back our attention in these like really extreme global pandemic times, and with John Kabat-Zinn. And so that was a really incredible opportunity to just be in space with just some of the just insightful, innovative thought leaders, as well as bringing in the conversation around our human Earth connection and our climate crisis. And so we launched season 2 of that in August, and Jay and I are about to launch season 2 of State of Union Yoga around June. And then, as far as like my farming business, yeah, like I'm still in this process where I'm a student, I'm learning, and each project is like an experiment to then create space where I can become a resource for our community. And so a big part of my journey right now is the continuation and amplification of our community. And I just want to give a shout out to brother John Boyd, who is like an OG in the game. And when you talked about legislation, he's doing that, from the 80s and the 90s. He is one of the only reasons why Black farmers have a seat at the table and have, USDA grants, and was a big proponent of why, this multi-million-dollar USDA grant program came up this year for Black farmers in that PP. I don't know all the details of it, but the pandemic fund. So just like big shout out to brother John Boyd, who lives fairly close to me down the road here, and is the president of the National Black Farmers Alliance. And yes, we do need that kind of organizing, around legislation to create, as well as that collective community care. And so, yeah, like my husband and I are about to launch our business that we've been working on for the last year, Wayfinder Holistics. And that is like a consulting company where we're just here as right now as an educational resource, where we really come in, we look at your landscape of your land, and we talk about what is the land asking right now from you? What does this land need to heal you? And how can you really bring in those acts of wellness into that experience? And so we come in and help you like look at your gardens and landscaping and putting in edible landscapes and the whole scope of everything, not just this like, monoculture mentality. And so I'm really excited about that. And the yoga business will run through that. And it's all like under this general umbrella of the work that we do to support the community. And then the long-term goal is to utilize this property that I'm on now as a stepping stone and a learning and space for potentially growing food for 50 families. That's the goal. So that's the goal with getting this 40-acre lease contract, so that we can get access to grants and get access to a greenhouse and a hoop house, so that we can grow food for 50 families and support our community, as well as working with other community gardens and organizations around here. That's at the forefront of our mission. So there's always so much going on. I feel like I just gave a whole story of my multiple outlets.
Listen, power is as it is, and you're so powerful in the ways that not only did you answer the call, but you completely immersed yourself in it, to allow listening to happen and for that call to grow into a huge vision, an interconnected vision, that will benefit not only like you, your family, your community, and the earth, and ultimately the earth. So I just want to thank again both of you for being here. Like I said, this conversation was so fire. And I appreciate so much you sharing your own stories that we can see from Dr. Carver's legacy. It's continuing to grow and continuing to nurture us. And we give thanks to our ancestors for making those huge commitments, to their own calling, and accepting their own calling so that we today get to benefit from their work. So thank you again so much. And we'll stay tuned. We're connected. We're forever connected. So I look forward to continuing to support your efforts. And thank you for being here today.